Hi there, welcome back. We're continuing now with this book, Many Lifetimes by Dennis Kelsey. And Dennis Kelsey was a psychiatrist, and he's married to Joan Grant, who is a psychic. So we're in chapter 4 because I'm reading alternate chapters. This is a chapter by Kelsey, and this is the second half of the chapter. So if you missed the first half of the chapter, I would suggest you go back because it's fascinating. But, it's up to you. Um, the concept of the superphysical body as a distinct element of the personality is important to the understanding of reincarnation and will also, I believe, prove valuable in psychiatry in that it may help one to direct therapy more precisely. The point was illustrated by the case of a young man who was suffering from increasing anxiety. For the first few sessions, Joan and I saw him together, but his story was so rich in the sort of emotional and conceptual material which often underlies this symptom that we did not suspect that an earlier personality might be involved. For this reason, I soon continued the therapy without Joan's assistance. But as the weeks went by, although ventilation and discussion of this material were bringing him certain benefits, such as improved relationships with his family, his anxiety was not diminishing. And then a session occurred in which I had a curious experience. When I feel uncertain of the direction of the next step during a course of therapy, I sit for some moments with my eyes closed and my body completely relaxed. I find that in this state, I very frequently get a hunch, which quickly proves of value. But on this occasion, instead of a hunch, I got a very vivid mental picture. I saw a young woman who I knew intuitively was the patient, wearing a blue dress which belonged to a period of at least 100 years ago. She was sitting in front of a mirror, smiling at herself, and obviously enjoying the reflection of her teeth, which were remarkably white and even. I recalled then that the patient had told me of an incident which had occurred shortly before his anxiety state had started. He had been in a bar where a fight was on the point of breaking out, and a youth had come up to him and said, "I'm going to kick your teeth in." My patient declared that he was not normally averse to a roughhouse, but these words sent him literally to feel faint, and he had bolted. He had been ashamed of what he called his cowardice, but also bewildered by it. As he put it, he was only a little chap. I could have eaten him. I regarded this episode as, at most, merely the trigger which had precipitated his illness and had attached little importance to it. But now, taking into consideration also the fact that the patient's teeth were quite unusually well kept and regular, I realized that it might be of significance. Support for this idea came when I asked him if he often had to visit the dentist. He blushed at the question and then admitted that the idea of anyone touching his teeth filled him with such repugnance that he had never been near a dentist. A week later, Joan entered the story. At about 5 o'clock, the patient's relatives had telephoned to say that on going into his room that morning, they had found him deeply unconscious from a large overdose of sleeping pills. The local doctor who had been with him most of the day had just left, satisfied that the danger was over. The patient lived 60 miles from London, and as he was now asleep, there was no point in us going down to see him that night. As Joan knew that I would not be free until at least 8 o'clock, she decided to do a level shift alone to try to find out what had been going on in his mind. When I went downstairs after my last patient left, I was alarmed at what I found, being not yet familiar with the effects on her of a particularly difficult identification. She was obviously in acute pain, and tears were pouring down her face. Her mouth was half open, and she managed to tell me that she dared not close it, because to do so would increase the agony of her lacerated gums. I can feel the blood clots in the tooth sockets. It was bad enough during the first 2 days, and after he pulled out all the teeth, but then the taste got even worse and worse. Not only dead blood, but pus. Then the fever started, and she died on the 4th day. But she forgave him before she died. It was half an hour, though. It seemed infinitely longer before Joan became sufficiently detached to give a coherent account of what had been happening. She had identified with the woman of whom I had had a mental picture during the last session, with the patient more quickly and completely than she had expected to be able to do. The period was the 3rd decade of the 19th century. In the county of Somerset, in the west of England, the woman was about 18 and had married a much older man because he was the most prosperous farmer in the district. He was so besotted with his young bride that she was able even to refuse him his marital rights on the excuse that she was too young to have a baby, which would spoil her pretty figure. She was renowned for the excellence of her teeth, for at that time scurvy was prevalent, and few adults had many teeth left. She enjoyed smiling at young men as much as they enjoyed being smiled on. Her husband's jealousy steadily increased until one night, in a fury of rage and thwarted sex, he flung her on the bed and lashed her wrists and ankles to the corner posts. Joan thinks his original intention was only rape, and that his wife drove him beyond the brink of sanity by mocking him. He ran to the stables to fetch the pincers, which he used for extracting nails from the hoofs of his horses. He used this instrument to wrench out all her teeth. Joan presumed that the patient had been the farmer, and that his reaction to the threat to his own teeth had been based on the fear of retribution for his savagery. She hoped that he would be very much better now that she had relived the experience for him. By the following evening, he had recovered sufficiently from his overdose for his family to bring him to see us. It was immediately apparent that he was no better at all. He was still acutely agitated, and I had no doubt that, given the opportunity, he would repeat his attempt at suicide. I therefore arranged for his admission to a private nursing home. Oh, there's an ambulance going out there. I don't know if you can hear it. When we visited him next day, he seemed no longer to be suicidal, but he was still acutely agitated. She repeated the story of that incident. No, he repeated, the story of that incident in a bar over and over again, laying particular stress as though this explained everything on the fact that the youth had approached him on his right-hand side. Joan told the patient about her her level shift. Joan told the patient about her level shift, but the story left him completely unmoved. At our next visit, he launched again into an account of the episode in the bar, still laying stress on the fact that he came up on my right side, you see? This reminded Joan that the husband had stood on the right-hand side of the bed, and she realized that the patient had been not the husband, but the wife. The effect upon the patient of this news was dramatic. He had not the slightest difficulty in accepting the entire story as valid, and by the end of the session, his anxiety had vanished. I did not expect that this degree of improvement, which had occurred so suddenly and, so far as the patient was concerned, so smoothly, would persist. I finally anticipated that by the next morning he would have slipped back at least a little, but on the contrary, we found him completely calm and very cheerful. On the following day, he was equally well, and it seemed unjustifiable to keep him in the nursing home any longer. I telephoned to the family to collect him, warning them that they should remain alert to the possibility of a relapse. However, all this happened more than 5 years ago, and so far his anxiety has not returned. On the general validity of Joan's ability to shift level and identity with an earlier personality of someone with whom she has a personal link, I have no doubt whatever. Her only mistake in this instant had been to assume that the patient had been the husband, as it was the fact that he did not react at all to being identified with the husband, but with such an immediate and lasting recovery followed identification with the wife is exceedingly interesting. If the story had offered him merely a convenient fantasy behind which he could shelter, I think it is virtually certain that he would have relapsed within days or weeks, and unless Joan, by some process which does not fall within the ordinary framework of understanding, had been able to relive the experience on his behalf, I think it is most improbable that he would have recovered without undergoing an intense abreaction himself. One evening, the conversation had turned upon the probable cause of alcoholism. No one had contradicted anything original. No. Let me read that again. No one had contributed anything original. So after dinner, I asked Joan to shift level and see if she could find any relevant information. She lay down on the sofa, closed her eyes, and in a couple of minutes snapped her fingers to indicate that she was ready for the first question. What are the causes of alcoholism? I asked her. There are many causes, but one of them is when alcohol has been used as a primitive anesthetic to dull the pain for an amputation. I am seeing men who have been wounded in minor battle. The period is the Napoleonic Wars. They are in a large barn, which is being used as an operating theater. There are holes made by cannon fire in the walls. Some of the wounded are lying on straw and others on the earth floor. A surgeon holding a blood-stained saw is leaning against a trestle table, waiting for the next patient to be put on it. The surgeon is exhausted. The men waiting their turn are trying to drink themselves into oblivion, or at least get drunk enough to numb the pain. But some of them vomit the crude eau de vie, water of life. before it has had time to take effect. The Frenchman and the enemy, I don't know their nationality except that they are not English, have tremendous compassion for each other. It seems quite irrelevant that they have so recently fought on opposite sides. The stench of gangrene is appalling. I shall have to break off for a minute, or I shall throw up. When she had again shifted level after the brief rest, I repeated my question. Now I am seeing one man much more clearly than any of the others. He's in great pain and in despair because his shattered leg will have to be cut off. He has had some eau de vie, but not enough to help him. He is terrified of screaming when he is carried to the table and of dying of pain. He is watching the leather jug, which is being taken from man to man on the other side of the barn. He is praying that it won't be empty before he gets another chance at it. He has an anguished longing for more and more alcohol, as is the only hope for dulling his agony. He died of loss of blood while he was still longing for alcohol. Someone who has died when longing for alcohol to stop unbearable pain may find that pain reawakens his longing for alcohol, but he wants more and more of it because in the original situation he didn't get enough to do any good. This is the start of the craving. Question: how can the condition be cured? Answer: in the case of the wounded man, take him back to the original situation, but be sure he has not taken any alcohol. When you do so, it's important that he does not confuse the present with the past. He will be freed only by regressing, unless someone like me can relive it for him and to release the trapped energy. This used to be done by the priests, usually by two of them working together. This was so that two priests could check with each other to be sure that neither had missed any factor, and also because they could share the burden of identification. It is the release of the repressed energy which caused the abreaction, whether the patient feels it or not. It is felt by the person who is acting as the priest. Can you tell me anything about addiction to morphia? Oh, this is the question. Question: can you tell me anything about addiction to morphia? And this is, of course, Dennis Kelsey asking the question. And now Joan is answering. Answer: opium I have known in many lives. It was used in very wise civilizations, but it is important to give enough of it. A quarter grain of morphia may arouse a need which it does not satisfy. It is the unsatisfied need which leads to the desire for more, and so leads to a craving should the person die in acute pain. Question: was opium used for other purposes except the relief of pain? Answer: only by fools. There had already been several occasions when Joan, either through a dream or during a level shift, had produced some specific piece of information which, although it had no relevance to anyone we had not yet met, soon proved to have preceded the arrival of a patient to whose therapy it was entirely opposite. I am inclined to think that it was more than a coincidence that soon after the episode of the Napoleonic soldier who had died in agonizing sobriety during the amputation of his leg, something very akin to the mechanism of alcoholism he had described was observed in practice. A young man who was visiting friends nearby came to dine with us one evening. He confided to me that he feared he was becoming an alcoholic and asked me if I might be able to help him. He had to leave in 48 hours, which I pointed out did not leave us long for therapy. However, he agreed to the suggestion that he might have 2 preliminary sessions, and then, if he felt they were promising, he would return as soon as possible. He was highly intelligent and rather cynical, and had frankly admitted that he could not accept our theories about reincarnation. He thought he would be difficult to hypnotize, but he reached a very deep level very rapidly and immediately went into a curious spasm. I called for Joan, and by the time she arrived, in a couple of minutes, the spasms had turned to violent writhing, which affected only his head and trunk. It seemed as though he was struggling to escape from from bonds which were holding his arms in a spread eagle position. He thrust his head back until his spine arched in an extremity of effort. He was making heart-wrenching noises, half groan, half cry. In a barely decipherable sputter, he gasped, "They're cutting my tongue out with a shiv." Joan was trying to help him by sharing his experience, but could only get a sketchy outline of the background, as we were both fully occupied in keeping him from falling off the couch. The period was the Spanish Civil War, probably in 1938. He had been working for some kind of resistance movement, or else he was taking a message behind the enemy lines. He had been caught, and he was being tortured to reveal the name of people he was working with. He had been savagely beaten and kicked, which took place in a stone-built hut. The 4 men who were trying to extract information must have heard something which alarmed them, for they suddenly decided that they must make a fast getaway. They had already trussed his feet together, and they now tied his wrists to iron rings in opposite walls. Cutting out his tongue was an afterthought to make sure that he would not give his secret away to them. He would not, if, no, to ensure that as he would not give his secret away to them, he would not be able to tell it to anyone. He died alone many hours later, agonized not only by pain, but by thirst, the craving for water becoming more and more predominant. Added to his physical anguish was the fear that his friends would think he had betrayed them by slipping over the border and would never know that he had refused to divulge their names. It was very difficult to pull him back to the present day. When I first grasped his hand, he identified me with one of his captors, and he became violent. Gradually, I got him to obey such instructions as grasp my hand, release it, grasp it again, let it go, press your hand against the wall. Slowly, he reclaimed his present identity and recognized us and his surroundings. When I believed he was back in normal consciousness, I told him to move from the couch to a chair. As he did so, he asked for a glass of water. I fetched him a large tumblerful, which he drained, and then demanded a second, and yet a third. I told him he had drunk as much water as was good for him. He shouted, "Bring me a jug!" At this point, I realized that he was not completely back in the present, but he was still suffering from the thirst in which he had died. I told him to sit on the edge of the couch while I counted slowly from 20 down to 1, which brought him fully back into the present. He said, as though startled, "I am no longer in the least thirsty." He then told me, for the first time, that for as long as he could remember, he had been subject to a compulsive thirst. Wherever he happened to be, he would be acutely anxious until he had assured himself that he would be able to get something to drink the moment that he became thirsty. In a strange house, or in a classroom, or a cinema, he was ill at ease until he found out where he could instantly get a glass of water. Then when he was older and had become introduced to alcohol, this too became the focus of his compulsive need. Immediately after the session, his compulsion disappeared, and in the year which had elapsed, he had had no desire for alcohol and has, in fact, been a teetotaler. His attitude to this experience is interesting. He admits wholeheartedly that his recovery was due to the one session, but he is still of the opinion that it has no bearing on the validity of reincarnation. Okay. One of the difficulties in psychiatry is that similar symptoms may have very different origins. Take, for instance, the irrational fear of feathers. As Joan has described in the case of Dr. Carr Clarkson, Kerr Clarkson, this fear had its source in the death of one of the earlier personalities, which was associated with vultures. But 4 years ago, a patient of mine, a woman of 30, with an almost identical phobia, was cured of it by reliving an episode in which, at the age of 3, she had fallen down in the farmyard and had been trampled by a flock of geese. If the patient can relive the relevant episode, which has occurred in his current lifetime, he will still probably be cured. But supposing neither the patient nor his relatives can remember such an episode, for the excellent reason that it never occurred, how then can one hope to explain the symptom? Here we get into the field of psychoanalysis and begin to think in the terms of the symbolical significance which feathers might have for this particular patient as a result of the torturous mechanisms of the unconscious. And while there is no doubt that in a certain number of cases, this line of research will produce the answer, it is equally certain that in considerable proportion of cases, it will be unsuccessful. In a proportion of such failures, the cause undoubtedly lies within the patient, who for one reason or another is unable to bring himself to face some essential aspect of himself. But this explanation, which is exceedingly tempting to a therapist who is resolutely determined not to counteract the possibility that there may be other levels of the patient's experience in which the answer might lie, can be overdone. Only time and experience will show whether I am right, but I hope that the concept of the superphysical body will contribute to our understanding of a variety of conditions which, in my experience, may be very difficult to believe. For instance, the pain experienced by some people, which appears to be coming from a limb that has been amputated, the so-called phantom limb. I recall such a case, which I encountered early in my psychiatric career. The patient was a man of 50 with an unusually powerful physique, of which he had always been proud. But at the age of 15, an injury to a knee had become septic, necessitating eventually the loss of that leg. Ever since the amputation, he had suffered intense phantom limb pain. 2 operations aimed at freeing any nerves in the stump which might have been caught up in scar tissue have proved totally ineffective. And 2 years before he had consulted me, he had undergone an operation on his spinal cord, at which the nerve tracts carrying pain from that region were cut. But still, the pain persisted. Psychologically, it was not difficult to find personality factors which might theoretically have accounted for his pain. But they were dealt with thoroughly, and still the pain was unaffected. It seems at least possible that the original injury to his physical leg was, in this case, for some reason transmitted to his supraphysical, which refused to accept that the leg had been removed. And it is conceivable that therapy directed at healing his superphysical might have brought relief. Related to this type of problem, possibly, are some of those cases in which, following an accident, a lack of function persists, which is in excess of what the remaining physical disability would seem to justify. Undoubtedly, some of these cases are linked to a hope of financial compensation for the accident on a scale which would be diminished by a complete recovery. But I do not think this explains all of them. It seems to me, at least, possible that sometimes it is the superphysical which has been injured and still needs treatment. Another condition which may be difficult to relieve is hypochondriasis. Hypochondriasis. The fear that one is suffering or about to suffer from some grave disease. It is characteristic of this type of anxiety that it is not relieved by the most detailed reassurance based upon the findings of searching, examinations, and investigations. A proportion of these cases can be explained and helped along orthodox psychological lines. For instance, their fear may be the expression of unconscious feelings of guilt for which they are trying to punish themselves. But there are others in which this approach seems to be valueless, and in at least some of these, I believe that the anxiety stems from an earlier supraphysical, which died of the disease from which the patient is convinced he is still suffering. Finally, there is the rather large group of cases whose symptoms tend to be labeled hysterical. Such patients either have the physical symptoms for which no organic cause can be found, or an organic condition which appears to be causing a quite disproportionate degree of distress or disability. And these preeminently are the patients who tend to be suspected of having symptoms for an unconscious purpose. Sometimes this suspicion is justified, as in the case of the patient I described in the second chapter, who suffered from a paralysis of her legs. In that instance, the purpose was quickly discovered, and as soon as she could see a more acceptable way of dealing with her situation, the use of her legs returned. But there are occasions when the therapist, to his own entire satisfaction, has exposed the patient's unconscious purpose, yet the symptoms still persist. At such times, it may be particularly tempting to assume that the patient prefers to continue to be ill. Undoubtedly, in certain instances, this assumption is well founded, but very often I believe it is generally unjust to the patient because his symptoms, like those of some of the sufferers from hypochondriasis. I don't know if that's how you pronounce it. Hypochondriasis, hypochondriasis, hypochondriasis. There, I've tried them all. I don't know. Tell me which one's right. Are a resonance to an earlier supraphysical. Two examples of this mechanisms. Two examples of this mechanic. Oh dear. I better quit pretty soon. I'm not doing so well. Let me see. How many more pages are there till we break? Oh, there's a good break. Okay, 2 more pages and then we'll break, okay? All right, let's see. 2 examples of this mechanism were furnished by Joan. Obviously, they would have been more telling if they had concerned patients who had no knowledge of our ideas. But if Joan's faculties enable her to recognize a mechanism in herself, it will be easier to recognize when it is occurring in other people. The first occasion was when I decided to try to find out why Joan, when reading or eating in bed, always lay flat on her back, her legs straight, and only raising her head a few inches from her single pillow. This worried me because of the obvious danger of choking. When swallowing in a supine position, I also knew that she had already scalded herself severely enough to be kept in bed for 10 days and scarred on the neck and chest for several months when her thumb had slipped off the handle of a mug of nearly boiling soup. Whenever I reminded her to sit up, she did so, but when alone, she would revert absent-mindedly to her habitual position. Matters came to a head one day when I found her drenched in orange juice. Suddenly I realized that her posture reminded me of that of a patient who is paralyzed from the waist down. I mentioned this to her, and she told me of an incident which had occurred when she was 4 years old. She had been running ahead of her nanny to open a massive oak door at the end of an avenue in her parents' garden, but the door had been taken off its hinges for repair and had been left propped temporarily in a position by a plank. The plank had slipped when Joan touched it. She remembered the door falling towards her. Trying to run, being knocked down by a blow between her shoulder blades, and then lying trapped face downwards. A gardener had tried to lift the door off of her, but it was so heavy that he could not do so until two other men arrived to help him. The nanny lifted her up, and when Joan said her leg was hurting, the nanny, who must have panicked, stood her on it to see if it was broken. It was. Joan felt it crumple under her, and then she fainted. She retained a vivid memory of the difficulties in the healing of this fracture, which had necessitated her leg being kept in plaster for many months, but she had no recollection of a fact about which she had later been told, that for 3 weeks it was feared that she would be paralyzed. As her fourth and fifth thoracic vertebrae still show signs of that old fracture, I presume her spinal cord had been bruised. When I asked Joan to shift level, I anticipated that she would recover details of this period of paralysis, but instead she regressed to the childhood. She found herself identified with a girl of 20 who had been paralyzed from the waist down in a riding accident. This girl was an earlier personality of her own. Her Christian name was Lavinia. She was English, and she died in 1875. She was married, but not to me. What an interesting sentence. She was married, but not to me. Love it. But by this time, I was familiar with hearing Joan reliving episodes from earlier lifetimes as matter-of-factly as though she were telling me about some incident from her current one. I was startled when she exclaimed, "Bring me back fast. I'm getting so closely identified with Lavinia's paralysis that I'm afraid I'm affecting my own legs." In a couple of minutes, she had returned to normal working consciousness, but she could not move her legs. This was new and a most alarming experience for her, but she remained sufficiently detached to tell me to put my hand on her back to discover which muscles were out of action. Although I was already familiar with the concept of the superphysical body, I was not yet fully alive to the importance for treatment of distinguishing between it and other aspects of the personality. Therefore, I told her to shift level again and to try to find out more about the circumstances of the accident. She did this in considerable detail, the essential information being that Lavinia had been locked in her bedroom by her husband to prevent her riding to the hounds on that particular morning. His motive was jealousy, because she had danced too often with a young man whom she had met for the first time at a hunt ball the previous evening, and her husband was determined she should not meet him again. Lavinia had climbed out of the bedroom window and so reached the stables, only to find that all the horses were out, except a young stallion that not even her husband dared to ride. She saddled him with the aid of a reluctant stable boy, who cannot have tightened the girths properly, for when she was in sight of the hounds, rebellious, triumphant, the side saddle slipped, As she was taking offense, and both she and the horse suffered a heavy fall, which broke her back. As I mentioned, that it was Lavinia's anger against her husband which had caused her to fail completely to integrate. I concentrated for some hours on trying to bring every facet of such feelings to the surface. The approach had no beneficial effect whatsoever, and Joan's legs were still useless. Finally, she said, Lavinia's body will never be able to go until you have healed it. The idea of healing an earlier superphysical had never previously occurred to me. So I had to act intuitively, turning Joan onto her face and telling her to shift level so as to be receptive. I placed my hands on her back in that region which I hoped corresponded with the site of Lavinia's fracture. Then I made a vivid mental picture of such an injury, telling Joan that I was going to drive energy through her body and into the superphysical of Lavinia. I have noticed that when attempting any kind of healing, I feel on some days that I am being more effective than on others. And there is also a sensation that, for the time being, I have done all I can. I experienced this after about 10 minutes, and I told Joan that Lavinia's fracture was now healed and that she could find that she had now regained the full use of her legs. Soon she was able to move them, albeit rather feebly. I then told her to return to the present day and normal waking consciousness. We both assumed that this was the end of the incident, for her legs were so functioning normally, were soon functioning normally. However, the following morning she told me that during the night she had found it difficult not to resonate to Lavinia and had twice woken to find that she was suffering a recurrence of the paralysis. But as these symptoms had subsided after she switched on the light and read for a few minutes, she decided not to waken me. That afternoon, I again sat beside her while she shifted level. Again, she identified closely with Lavinia, and we learned many more details about the 3 years that she had been confined as a cripple, either to her bed or to a chaise longue in her bedroom. There was a recurrence of the previous session's symptoms, so I repeated the same technique. Suddenly, Joan exclaimed, Now I can see Lavinia getting up from her bed and walking freely. There is no need to do any more. She then fell peacefully asleep and slept until early the next morning. Thereafter, Joan no longer assumed her supine posture and now alters her position as spontaneously and frequently as would anyone else with normal powers of movement. But there was another feature which I found equally interesting. The first Lavinia session, had ended when I told Joan that the injuries suffered by her earlier superphysical had been healed and that therefore she would be able to use her legs normally. But the fact that she had again resonated to Lavinia during the following night with a recurrence of symptoms indicates that the return of function had been due only to my suggestion. By contrast, the second session had ended when Joan herself declared that she could see Lavinia moving freely. And after this, there was no relapse. So it seems reasonable to conclude that something was achieved in the second session which had a validity of its own, was not merely due to my suggestion, and affected Lavinia at least as much as it affected Joan. Okay, there's a natural pause here, so I'm going to pause here and resume next time. Let's say we're about 2/3 way of the way through this chapter. Thought I could finish it, but you know what? The light is dimming and I don't know, maybe I'm tired. So we'll finish it next time, okay? I hope you're enjoying it. I certainly am. My goodness, eh? Lavinia. Hmm. Okay.